If you're like me at all and you have a day job and kids, your most valuable asset is your time. And nowadays, before I even consider buying a new device, I really have to factor in how long it's going to actually take for me to start making music on that thing and factor that into the whole buying decision. So today, I want to share my experience on the devices that I reviewed over these past few years and rank them from easiest to hardest Groovebox to learn and use. I'm going to be ranking them based on 3 criteria. First, initial jammability, which is how much you can do with it straight out of the box. No reading the manual, no looking at tutorials. The second is the learning curve, which corresponds to how long it took me to study and really learn the thing to a level that I felt I was comfortable with, as well as how hard it was to actually understand. And finally, the return user barrier, a term which I just invented, which I hope catches on among my colleagues for these kinds of reviews, which corresponds to how hard it is to pick up that Groovebox again after you stopped using it for a reasonable amount of time. To give you a better understanding of what I mean by the return user barrier, I'll give you an example. I first discovered it when I was playing The Witcher 3, an amazing yet very complex game. I was a new dad at the time, and after my initial run, I stopped playing it for a few weeks. When I came back to the game though, I didn't really remember what was going on in the story, and I had absolutely no clue as to the mechanisms to craft weapons or do potions or even cast spells. My only real option was to start over, so I ended up dropping it. That would be an example of a high return user barrier. On the other hand, God of War, which I was also playing at the time, had a far more simpler story. The mechanisms were more straightforward, and it was easy to pick up even after a long hiatus. This while still remaining an extraordinary game, so I could jump back in whenever I wanted to. That would constitute a low return user barrier. So with that all out of the way, let's start at the bottom of the list with the easiest device I've ever learned. The Teenage Engineering Op-1. Straight out of the box, the Op-1 might be one of the most friendliest devices I've ever used. Thanks to a concise user interface, color-coded knobs, and very beautiful screen, you can start jamming on the thing as soon as you turn it on. Thanks to its very playful approach to sound design and disregard to conventional parameters, you can also start tweaking your sounds right away with very enjoyable results with absolutely no idea what you're actually doing. Initial jammability? Very high. Ironically, the Op-1 is also surprisingly deep, and therefore to really learn it inside and out does require a bit of dedication. It's full of hidden tricks and functions, and the lack of those conventional parameters that makes it so initially accessible can make it quite hard to really fully master, especially when making a whole song. The whole 4-track tape recorder can be very tricky, and not having an undo button is by far one of the greater frustrations that I've ever come across on a Groovebox. One thing that really helps though is that since it's so small and it has an internal battery, you can fire it up pretty much at any time at any place. So you have way more access to it on a daily basis compared to a Polybrute, for example. And that makes the process of actually learning it become way easier and faster as well. So learning curve, medium. As for leaving it alone and not using it for an extended period of time, I'm not really an expert because I never really stopped using the Op-1 for very long. The thing practically lived in my backpack, so I'd use it throughout the week. Now, I did one time give it about a month of not using it when I went on a vacation, and when I came back to it, I remembered almost everything I really needed and only had to check the manual and forums for very specific things. I'd say that once you learn the Op-1 once, afterwards it's kind of like riding a bicycle. So return user barrier, very low. Coming in hot after the Op-1 is the Novation Circuit Rhythm. This Groovebox is pretty simple and straight to the point. It gives you a few macro knobs and retrolit buttons with clear titles for you to navigate the device, and comes packed with some pretty awesome sounds to get you going. Just a little digging and you can have a track set up in seconds. The very colorful and extremely satisfying pads invite you to let loose and enjoy the music. The lack of a proper screen might mean you initially struggle a little more to get your footing compared to the Op-1, for example, but within the first few minutes I was already making a track on the rhythm. So initial jammability, high. As for the more complex functions of the circuit, I did need to spend a bit more time reading the manual and checking out some video tutorials. Understanding it, while not rocket science at all, did demand a bit more effort, especially when using the submenus. mostly because you don't have a screen like on the Op-1 to tell you exactly what you're doing and where you are. So the only visual feedback that you get is through the color changes in the buttons and the pads. Now don't be discouraged, however, because the circuit does have the same portability buff that the Op-1 has, and after getting used to the workflow, it becomes extremely fast and intuitive. Learning curve? Medium. After my initial review of the circuit, I stopped using it for a little over a month before returning to it. Though I could still do the basics, I did feel that the gap in my knowledge had grown enough for me to need to go back to the manual again to really know what I was doing, especially regarding sampling and effects. So even though I could do some light jamming, getting back to it did require a bit more effort and a little bit of studying again. However, the return user barrier remains low. Next on this list is the Polyend Tracker. Getting started on the tracker was a very different experience than any other Groovebox that I had ever had until that point, mainly because I'd never used a tracker before. The vertical layout and abundance of text seemed initially quite intimidating, but thankfully you get lots of dedicated buttons with accompanying text, color codes, and a huge screen to give you all the information you need and how to get there. After loading up a few sounds, I started with the sequence quite quickly and was having fun in no time. Initial jammability? Medium. The learning curve on the tracker, however, is pretty surprisingly low. I think it's mainly because there's so much information available to you on the screen, and help messages will pop up here and there explaining what an effect does. The only things I still kind of struggle with are the granular and the wavetable synthesizers, and I can't really say I have mastered them yet, though to be honest, I don't really use the tracker that way and rely mostly on samples. So learning curve, medium. As for coming back to the tracker, it's not even an issue. I've had it for a little over a year, and I've had to stop using it multiple times since then. Every time I come back to it, there's little to no friction to get started. So once again, mostly because it's all spelled out to you in plain English right there on the screen, you'll have no problem to just jump back into the tracker. So the return user barrier is pretty damn low. Next up on the list, and you might be surprised by this one, is the Sp404Mk2. Roland's latest version of their very popular Groovebox hit the market by storm, and for months there was just no way to get your hands on it. Stock was out everywhere. When I finally got my hands on one, I was ecstatic. Having had experience with the previous Sp404SX, I might be a bit biased, but I found that just like with the SX, the Mk2 was pretty much just turn on the power switch and get going. It also really helps that it comes preloaded with a bunch of sounds for you to play around with, so the initial jammability on this thing is through the roof. Aha, but initial jammability and the actual mastery of the device are two different things, and I feel that the Mk2 might be the very best example of that. You see, Roland didn't only make it better, they made it bigger, they made it deeper, they made it quite staggering if I'm being honest. They put in more effects, a better sequencer, even a DJ mode. Especially since the last update, Sp404Mk2 has seen some major growth and of course, more complexity as well. Even before all of these improvements, learning to really perform on an Sp404 was kind of like learning an instrument more than just a Groovebox. With the added functions, it's become sort of like a workstation, at least more than ever before. And even though I've had it for almost a year, I still feel that I'm just scratching the surface. Learning it not only requires theoretical study, it requires practice, and that's why the Mk2 is so far up on this list. Learning curve, high. As for leaving the Mk2 alone and coming back to it, I've done precisely that in the last few weeks, and I am kind of sad to report that beyond the initial finger drumming and resampling techniques of yore, I've absolutely forgotten how to access most of the secondary functions. I'd say that the problem is that the front panel is now missing a lot of things that the Sp404Mk2 can do, and it might be wise to get kind of a new faceplate with more text on it, or make a master cheat sheet that you can keep with you when you forget about the secondary functions on the Sp404Mk2. If the SP is going to be playing a major role in your setup, this might not be an issue at all, but for someone with multiple devices that's constantly switching out gear, I gotta say that the return user barrier on this one is high. Are you liking this list so far? Let me know in the comments below if you agree, and tell me about what gear you found to be the easiest to learn, as well as the Groovebox that had you crying in a corner. The next Groovebox on this list, and remember, they're getting harder, is the Synthstrom Deluge. When I first got the Deluge, I made a video praising how intuitive, inspiring, and fast it was to use. That opinion holds true to this day. The front panel is very inviting, and that pad grid / piano roll is perhaps one of the most enjoyable ways of sequencing that I've had the pleasure of using so far. As for getting a track going straight out of the box and performing with said track, I'd have to say that the Deluge is one of the best out there. Initial jammability, very high. Now, just like with the Sp404Mk2 though, the Deluge is very deep. It's one of the closest things to Ableton in a box that you're likely to find. However, to access all those hidden features, it has one of the most complex button combo systems I've encountered. So much that I fully recommend getting a faceplate cover that has all the button combos written out for you, because if not, it's just way too much to remember if it's not your only Groovebox or at least your main daily driver. I should clarify though that I own the calculator screen version and not the new LED one, and getting around its insides was just a 4-digit nightmare. Hopefully the new screen fixes a lot of that, and I hope I can get my hands on one sometime in the near future to test it out. But at least in my experience, to get beyond the basics and really reach proficient status on the Deluge, the learning curve is high. Now, back when I had my Deluge, I used it quite a lot and I featured it in many of my videos and was quite comfortable with it. However, after about 2 months of not using it, when I returned to it, I had pretty much forgotten all the button combos and basically had to start over from scratch and relearn how to make it do what I wanted it to do from zero. And it's not even the simple stuff either. I'd have to like check the manual or a video on YouTube just to remember how to get to the audio looper and select the audio in. It's infuriating. It's a worthwhile investment for sure, but a pain nonetheless. So I'm gonna have to say that the return user barrier on this one is a bit high. Up next, the Elektron Octatrack. No self-respecting list on learning curves and grooveboxes would be complete without at least mentioning the almighty Octatrack. It's been around for more than 10 years and you still see new tutorials pop up on YouTube every day. And that's because no two Octatrack users will use it in the same way. No two experiences are equal, especially when it comes to learning this bad boy. When you first unbox the Octatrack, your initial experience will vary greatly depending on if this is your first Elektron box or you've had something like a Digitakt before. In my case, I'd had the Digitakt for a little over a year, so the initial moments were very exciting, promising even. I was jamming on it pretty quickly when it first arrived, but little did I know that I was barely scratching the surface. If, however, the Octatrack is your first Elektron box, the experience might be a bit more challenging. Initial jammability, medium, and very user dependent. And now on to the good stuff, the legendary Octatrack learning curve. Much has been written in the history books about it, and though I do agree that it's a hard machine to learn, I think that it has been a bit exaggerated over time. First, because 10 years ago, there wasn't really any proper literature available. The Elektron user manual seemed to have been written by a very disgruntled engineer or perhaps an early AI that had never talked to a human before. Nowadays, aside from the vast content available for free on YouTube, you have user-friendly and enjoyable text, my favorite being SynthDog's Octatrack manual. I'm not affiliated to him in any way, but he's the reason I finally feel I got a grip on this thing. For any of you out there considering getting into an Octatrack, just know, it's not hard, it's just a lot to take in. My suggestion, the Octatrack does many things, but if you try to learn them all at once, you will get frustrated. Like learning math and biology at the same time while running a sprint. Instead, learn one thing. Learn it well, and then move on. It might be a while before you really feel comfortable with using the whole machine, but once you get there, believe me, there's nothing like it, and it's probably one of the machines that I'm most happy that I stuck with. Learning curve? Legendary. As for leaving the Octatrack alone for an extended period of time and coming back to it, I really don't recommend it. Once again, this thing does a lot, and if you don't use it often, when you come back to it, you will have forgotten half of what it can do and won't remember how to make it do the stuff you remember that it's supposed to do. Personally, I've been using this thing for years and I still get stuck on even basic functions and I have to go into Google or search tutorials on YouTube just to keep going, which can be very frustrating. I don't mind it, however, because honestly, it's probably one of my favorite devices ever for making music, jamming, and performing. Just be warned, the return user barrier on this is high. If you're enjoying this video, please remember to support my channel by liking, subscribing, and maybe leaving a comment down below. Also, if you want to buy any other Grooveboxes on the list, please do so using the affiliate links down in the description. That way you support the channel so I can keep making videos just like this one. Thanks for the support. Now to top off our list, I needed something that really made me sweat to get to grips with. So this one's kind of special. Just because this is the only Groovebox I've had in all of these years where upon unboxing it, I couldn't even make a single sound on this thing. Not a peep, not a single note. I mean, literally, I had to check the manual just to learn how to set the volume. And I'm speaking, of course, of the Dirtywave M8. If you've never used a tracker before, and especially if you've never used the Game Boy LS DJ, beware of the M8, because the first few hours with it are daunting, to say the least. And it's not just the limited buttons on the faceplate or the lack of knobs or faders, it's the abbreviated titles, the button combos, the workflow, even the numbering is alien. Even though I love it now, the first few days on the M8 were rough. So that's why I'm giving it the honor of having an initial jammability ranking of absolute 0. As I said before, the initial moments with the M8 are like learning Mandarin. Nothing makes sense, and it's all very strange if you've never seen anything like it before. But just like learning a new language, there comes a threshold where once something clicks, everything else just starts flowing all by itself. You can see the matrix clearly. That was my experience with the M8 at least. After a very rough start of what could be described as a learning wall instead of a curve, it suddenly just clicked, made sense, and everything just started coming naturally from there on out. For all of you out there that are just starting out with a new M8 or are thinking of getting one, just be brave enough to face the initial friction. Because once it's gone, you unlock something amazing, inspiring, and stupidly fast. Learning curve, hardest. Now, just like with the Op-1, this thing is small and it's battery powered, so it kind of lives in my backpack. So I really can't say that I've experienced that return user barrier yet, because ever since I had it, I haven't stopped using it. However, I do find that the M8 has a sort of unexpected return user barrier, but not necessarily because of the workflow or the button combos really. At least in my case, what makes me think twice about using the M8 is how it handles presets. If you've ever heard the music coming out of an M8, then you know what I mean when I say that it sounds phenomenal. Both the synths and the effects have absolutely no right to come out of such a tiny little box. But finding those sounds is a bit cumbersome. I would really love an update on the M8 where you could maybe search the presets by category instead of by synths, or maybe just, dump a whole folder of new instruments. If such a library of instruments for the M8 already exists out there, please let me know. Anyway, I give the M8's return user barrier a score of medium. So before I leave today, just one final thing that I like to add, and that's that there's sort of a moral to this story. Every device that I've ever learned, be it easy or hard, has left its mark. It's made me gain a little more insight into music tech. It's given me experience. Learning something new is its own reward, and it's a way to keep your mind fresh and open. So don't write off a piece of gear just because it looks intimidating. Anyway, that's my list. I'd really love to know what devices you found easy to learn, as well as those that made you rip out your hair of frustration. I look forward to reading all about it in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video useful, or at least entertaining. Have a great week. See you next time.